Hello, welcome back. This is ProTailDev. This is the 7th day of the Harvest Mouse Game Jam. The last video was actually quite short. I managed to get a lot down because there was a lot of testing involved, a lot of trial and error, especially when it came to the scaling and how I wanted to do the animation. This one's only about 3.5 hours, something. Enough rambling, let's get into it. Okay, so with the limited time I had, I decided to go back into Blender and create ourselves an enemy. A very quick, very low poly enemy. And I kind of wanted it, at first I wanted to go for something like a Spriggan from, the classic games that we always see. But then I decided to go for something completely different. It's supposed to be like a corrupt enemy, a corrupt spirit. And so I was going for more of a... I know it's a little bit strange, but when I was thinking of different designs, I ended up thinking of like a fish trying to desperately seek out an object, and it kind of ended up looking more like a projectile as well, which is what I ended up wanting. I wanted something to seek out the tree and the player, and I wanted it to be somewhat menacing, which is why there are horns, which I originally wanted them to look like vines, but I ended up making them more look like horns in the end, which I think looks fine. It kind of matches as well. And then I kind of made the design as much as possible uniquely and weird as possible, just to kind of play around, not make it feel too blocky as well, to try and give it a little bit more of a presence. And then I had almost like tentacle kind of objects coming out, because that always creeps people out. And then, like I said, trying to make it as unique as possible. That was kind of what I was going for, is a unique design that you don't really see too often for things like corrupt spirits and stuff. You wouldn't think this was a corrupt spirit in the end, but this is exactly what I wanted. I wanted it to be very unique and different, and then almost like because of the sharp edges, it looks quite menacing and quite abnormal. With all the sharp edges, it looks dangerous. And so here we go, I start adding in a bunch of edges to kind of make it more smoother and less blocky. And then I duplicated it over the one horn when I edit it and bring it over to try and match it as much as possible. There isn't too much to this. I extruded this to bring it out, and then I was going to have a light in the center, which I think would glow red, and it would look really quite menacing. It'd also show where the enemy is much easier, so it wouldn't frustrate the player. Like I said, try and make it as uniquely designed as possible for an enemy that looks more like a projectile, and the eye is pretty much front and center, so it's easier to see where the enemy is. Then I look at like changing the colors and the material, try and get like a more almost wilted plant style, and then with the red body, make it, because red is always seen as like an aggressive color, like a more evil color. So that's what I do. I bring it back into Unity with the model and then make sure it's all set up. I add a point light, like I said I would, very center, which is going to be red, and change the different intensities. I ever play around quite a lot with how it would look, how strong the light was and where it would be placed. Then what I do is I make a look at script, and I did this in my previous Turtle Trial game. I needed that for the 2D environment so that the enemies would look towards the player, and in this case it would be much more complicated because I wanted it to be looking at the player or the tree, which is its target. Here I created my own script for it, but in the end I ended up moving this code over to, I believe, the move to attack, because it's the enemy that really is going to be focusing on this. I'm not going to be using this script anywhere else, really, for the enemy, because I just don't have any plans to. So I figured I'd move it back into the move to attack, and I can control it, what it looks at in there. So I moved back in here. I made sure that this everything was correctly positioned, and made sure that the look at script was on the enemy. And then I tried it out, see what it's like, and it was obviously a little bit weird. It was a little bit off, the offset wasn't quite correct, Now I think this is where I started to do the lookat script. So just as I did in the lookat script, this is where I started to move it all over into here, and then it would control. There would be code for looking at the tree or looking at the player, depending on what the target is, and the target would just be reassigned depending on what condition is being achieved. You know, whether the player is closer to the enemy or whether the tree is closer to the enemy. So I also fixed an issue where the enemy was staying still, and it was to do with a condition where they were either too far away from the player and not close enough to the tree, I think it was. The easiest way to fix that was just to add more to the condition required to stay still and to attack the player. Now something that is quickly to mention is that very, very briefly in that video I ended up deleting the lookat code and replacing it with some very basic transform.lookat brackets the target, which would have been the player or the tree, any of the targets, and the target would just be replaced with whether it was the tree or the player. So in the end the code wasn't really necessary, but I figured I'd show it because it's something I did. But yeah, that code wasn't necessary. It was necessary for the 2D game Turtle Trial, which is what I built it on. What I built the code initially, but in 3D Space is already a built-in mechanic for it, so I keep saying mechanic code. Okay, so that's the end of day 7. Very short video. Yeah, I'll see you next time for day 8.